Area Historical Society. The Society and the Washburn Heritage Association sponsor this series, this festival, with the help from a Washburn Community Foundation grant. Plus, we would like to thank the Harborview for sheltering us. A reminder, this series will continue on February 11th with The Art of Every Day, a film tribute to Ojibwe artist Carl Gabway. This is in conjunction with a display of his artwork at the center, the Cultural Center in Washburn, which will continue all month of February. A change from previous years of the festival, we have no music. But this does not mean that you have to leave as soon as the presentation is over. You do not. We still have the bar, and we have our friends. So please stay around and enjoy both. Tonight, Bob Mackroth is going to explain to us how it was at one time we thought we could do without the bar. So please welcome Bob Mackroth.
Good evening, Washburn! I had to say that, just once in my life. There we go. How's this? People hear me okay there? Yeah? Okay, we'll move this up there, sort of like that. How are we doing there? Now, can folks see the screen there, or should we turn down the house lights? We can see it. Yeah, you can see it great. And this way I can read my notes so I don't get lost in the middle of everything.
The request for turning them down.
I'm sorry?
The request is for turning them down.
Turning the lights down. Okay. Can we turn the lights down, folks, please? Can we find a way? Thank you. There we go. Getting there already. Well, it's a it's a lovely night out there tonight. You know, we're the MC, my lovely wife, and I were coming to driving down the hill tonight and saying, well, the weather is crummy, but at least it's not raining. Then it started raining. So I want to just kind of get out of here for a minute, get out into the summer, get out of the snow, and head out into the Apostle Islands. What does that have to do with Prohibition? Well, bear with me, okay? We're going to go out to Outer Island, the outermost of the Apostles. It's quite a haul, but it's worth the trip because it's one of my favorite spots out there in the islands. And especially when you're down at the sand spit, at the south end of the island, you're basically getting as close to far away as you can from the mainland here out in Lake Superior. And there on the beach, sticking out of the sand, the remains of a boat. Okay, having sound problems back there? Okay, let's see if we can get it a little, there we go. We hear okay in the back? Great, thank you. I'm sorry?
That's better. Better?
Great. Okay, if you can't hear, just wave your hand. Thank you very much. So we're out there on the sand spit at Outer Island. Maybe we got dropped off there. Maybe we took a kayak. Somehow we got out there, and there, sticking out of the dunes, the bones of an old boat. Just a nondescript old boat, right? Well, that boat has its own history. The boat is called the Faithful. That's the name of it. And it was built, it was built in 1925 for the LaFawn Fishery Company, a family-owned fishery at Two Rivers, Wisconsin, over on the Lake Michigan side. And I just happened to go past there earlier this year, so I snapped a picture and, thought about that boat sticking out of the sand out there on Outer Island. It was a fairly large boat, as fishing boats go. About, well, let me see, it was about 64 and a half feet in length, which is probably about half again the size of most of the fish tugs that you see out there. And you really wonder just about why it was, so large. It could hold a lot of fish, that's for sure, or maybe it could hold other cargo too. Yes, Yes, indeed. 3 years after the Faithful was built, they were caught carrying booze in from Canada in a Sheboygan press. October 11th, 1928. Everett LaFond of Two Rivers, Wisconsin, Edwin Anderson and Willard Gautier, Milwaukee, were arrested, and the tug Faithful, with 800 cases of liquor on board, was seized in the Straits of Mackinac Saturday by the Coast Guard cutter Cook. Well, 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 well. A few months later, Everett LaFond of Two Rivers, Wisconsin, was sentenced to a year and a day in Leavenworth Prison today by federal judge Fred Raymond. The cases of crewmen Edwin Anderson and Willard Gautier, arrested with LaFond, were dismissed. Well, gosh. So that's the boat sticking out of the sand at Outer Island, but this boat's story is not over by any means, because it keeps turning up. In 1930, Sheboygan Press again, the tug Faithful, largest craft of the Two Rivers fishing fleet, has a new owner today because the former operator said they could make no money fishing under restrictions of the 2-inch mesh law recently passed. Is that why they couldn't make money with that great big boat anymore? Because of the new fishing regulations? I wonder. I do wonder. Well, the boat got sold to a fisherman based out of Chicago who smashed it up on the way home. Very next day, that sells it in 1930. The tug Faithful, just purchased by Captain Frank Rotke, collided with the steamer Waukegan and was nearly sunk at 4 a.m. today at the mouth of the Milwaukee Harbor. Faithful, until yesterday, the pride of the Two Rivers fishing fleet, was rammed amidships by the Waukegan and barely managed to make a dock in the Milwaukee Harbor with his pumps going. Rotke had just closed the deal for her yesterday, attempting to bring the tug into Milwaukee early today to escape the crowded waters around Chicago. He set out about 7 o'clock last night in dense fog. Well, maybe not that great an idea after all. Well, Captain Rotke fixed up the boat, let's take another look at it, and hung on to her for several years, and then in 1936, sold her to the Russell brothers of Magdalen Island, who used it as a backup ferry boat for several years. They rebuilt the deck to accommodate automobiles, a few cars anyway, and used it when the Bing was out of service. 3 years later, they sold it again, and it was used for hauling barges filled with logs in from the lumber camp on Bear and Outer Islands. And logs, the timber there went into plywood used for making airplanes and gliders during the Second World War. And then finally, around 1952, it was scuttled on the beach, the Outer Island sand spit. And in almost 70 years since, the sand spit has shifted enough that it's now a couple hundred feet inland. So I guess what it brings to my mind is that phrase, if these bones could speak. All the way across the Apostle Islands and throughout this area, there are hidden stories which talk about that strange era when the nation attempted to cure some social ills through laws that may or may not have been adequately thought out. And we're going to examine that for the next rest of the evening. And of course, the whole issue of alcohol and prohibition and temperance and more alcohol goes back to the very earliest days of the Republic. As a PBS special a few years ago on prohibition put it, for a while America was considered a nation of drunks. Since the early years of the American Republic, they say, drinking has been at least as American as apple pie. Clergymen, craftsmen, and canal diggers drink. So do the crowds of men who turn out for barn raisings and baptisms and elections. Yeah, that elections part we know. I mean, sometimes you think they have to be drinking. Alcohol is embedded in the fabric of American culture. By 1830, the average American, now listen to this, by 1830, the average American over 15 years old consumes nearly 7 gallons. 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. About 3 times as much as we consume today. That gives you an idea. And of course, with that consumption came along a whole raft of social ills. As they put it, alcohol abuse wreaks havoc on the lives of many families. Daddy, says the caption, what has the saloon done for you? And there's a lot of truth behind the image, behind that. You have the picture there of the poor downtrodden mother caring for her children, and there's the father there sitting in the tenement, just absolutely dissolute. I once heard a story from an Irish-American woman, older Irish-American woman, who would talk about how, as a child growing up in a New York City tenement, her father would come home drunk and violent every Saturday night. And sometimes he would get so violent that her mother would take the children up to sleep on the roof of the building at night just to get away from Papa. That Irish-American woman was my grandmother. Now here, of course, in the North Country, there were other issues to deal with. Bayfield County Press, for one thing, pointed out it was a great year, 1912. It was a great year for the timber industry, except the lumber firms complain of a shortage of men. One prominent logging contractor says the rot-gut liquor that's sold in the small cities and villages of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota is playing havoc with hundreds of men. He declared that many of these men are unbalanced mentally as a result of their boozing. The logging contractor says that within the past 2 years, he has been obliged to let 25 or 30 men go because they were suffering mentally from drink. Well, in response to these issues and many more, a movement grew up called the Temperance movement. And essentially, in the beginning, the thrust to control alcohol was just what it said, temperance. It wasn't about banning alcohol. It was about educating people and putting in incentives to make people drink less. It was not about actually banning alcohol entirely, but as time went past, that quote-unquote temperance movement evolved into a prohibition movement. And of course, the most famous of the prohibitionist crusaders was a woman named Carrie Nation. I'm sure many of you have heard of Carrie and her hatchet. Carrie was a woman from Kansas who eventually got at the idea that what I need to do is go around and break up saloons. And she would, find her way into town and march into a saloon with her hatchet and just bust the hell out of the place, breaking the glass mirrors, knocking things over. And essentially, Carrie was a media personality. They didn't have that phrase in those days, but she was a master at gaining publicity for her cause and for herself. She made money off her lectures, after all. I hate people who charge for lectures. But anyway, Carrie was actually arrested something like 32 times in the span of 12 years from 1900 to 1910. She was so well known that bars would have signs, all nations welcome except Carrie. But really, as I say, she made a big splash, but there were others who actually pushed the movement a lot more effectively behind the scenes, such as Frances Willard, lady here in the lower right, who founded an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which in the period of the second half of the 19th century, the later 1800s, the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, was one of the most effective political advocacy groups there was. They advocated across the country. They had millions of members, and they got their cause noticed by the political figures, and they brought the issue out into the mainstream. Temperance, and then upon that, prohibition became a major issue in the country in the late 1800s, largely through the efforts of the WCTU and Frances Willard. However, in a sense, she made a strategic mistake in that the WCTU expanded its focus beyond simple one-issue politics. Willard was a progressive, very much she thought her organization should deal with a wide range of social issues. And let's see, excuse me a second, my note, I stapled my notes out of over here. Anyway, today we think of social conservatism, things like being against alcohol, whatever, is almost like a right-wing phenomenon associated with that wing of the political discourse. It was different in those days. Prohibition, temperance was considered a progressive stand because it was standing up for the welfare of the little person, and it became very much identified as a women's issue. And the WCTU ended up kind of casting its nets so widely that it lost effectiveness. They pushed for things like radical reforms, like the 40-hour work week, minimum age of consent for marriage, all things we take for granted now. But in those days, were considered, pretty far out, and the WCTU was a big part of making that part of the national discourse then as well. But they, in a sense, they lost the focus on the issue that brought them into existence, the temperance movement. Incidentally, there was quite a strong tie between the temperance movement and the women's movement of the time. No less a women's advocate than Susan B. Anthony started out as a temperance activist. And she really reoriented herself into focusing more on women's issues when she went to a temperance conference prepared to give a lecture, and the men in charge of it said, no, we don't want women to talk at this conference. Women should be here to listen and learn. That didn't sit well with Ms. Anthony, and the rest is history, very well. But that gives you an idea of, the cross currents between the temperance movement and the other progressive causes at the time, and the energy was being dispersed once again, a little bit out of sequence there. The energy was being dispersed into a wide range of issues and moved away from the simple issue of quote-unquote wet and dry. Now, everybody here knows what they mean by wet and dry. Wet means you allow alcohol. Dry is the prohibitionist thing. It became shorthand, the wet votes and the dry votes. And you see how well it's identifying here with the family issue. You got this rich saloon keeper on the left, and you got the poor forlorn mother with the children waiting for her husband to come home on the right. And was it a religious issue as well? Yes and no. In a large degree, quite a few religious organizations jumped on the temperance bandwagon, but there were divisions as well. For example, within the overall grouping of Lutherans within the U.S., there was quite a line down the middle between the Norwegian Lutherans and the German Lutherans. The German Lutherans had no problem with having a beer. The Norwegians largely were temperance supporters. Now, this gentleman here, who you see here, is Reverend Carl Christensen, pastor in the, I guess he just came home from the vet because he has this collar on. So, I don't know. But anyway, he was one of the strongest, most vociferous temperance advocates here in Washburn in the teens and 20s. Interesting guy, just as an aside. He came over as a youth from Norway, from up in the fjord country. During the Second World War, he provided crucial information to the military authorities, which was transmitted to a team of saboteurs who went into a very secret, hidden location in Norway to destroy a German nuclear laboratory where they were producing some of the precursors of the aborted German nuclear program. Interesting guy. He provided some inside dope on, oh yeah, you go up over this mountain. I remember it from when I was a kid. But anyway, Reverend Christensen, Lutheran, very strong temperance advocate. Meanwhile, the bishop, Catholic bishop in Superior, is saying, we do not want to get involved in the prohibition issue. The bishop in Superior said it becomes more evident daily that there is a strong sectarian power back of the present prohibitionist movement. And so he forbid any priests in the diocese, which covers this area, from attending any prohibition and temperance conferences, speaking in favor, whatever, because he felt it was a Catholic versus Protestant sectarian issue. Not only that, of course, there was a strong anti-immigrant issue, element to the whole prohibition issue as well. If you look at the caption on that, you have this drunken Irishman who looks like about a cross between a human being and some sort of simian, and that was published here in the Washburn paper. The Washburn Times notes 1921, foreigners make up by far the greater number of prohibition law violators. And, you know, I look, and that could have been my great-grandfather they're talking about. So the more you study prohibition, the more you see, you start coming up with familiar themes that are resonating today. You know, so many political issues that we talk about today, we can look back 100 years ago and see them reflected. Now, I'm not going to get into politics on one side or another, but I would folks ask you, as you hear some of these things, think about some of the issues we hear about today, whether it's immigration or whatever, and see how it reflects back in that time as well. One of the things that's definitely comes out as you look at this is a lot of the political techniques, the ways in which advocates of one position or other work to sway public opinion and sway the folks who make the laws, essentially were developed and fine-tuned by the prohibition advocates and are now in use today by various groups. And whatever, you take whatever hot button issue you want to take, there are groups that are saying, you know, our way is the only right way, the other way is everyone else is wrong. The techniques they use go back to some of these prohibition advocates. For example, let's take a look at this one right here. World War I provided a wonderful opening to the Prohibition Forces. You know, there's the caption, will you back me or back booze? Vote yes for prohibition. If you don't support me, you're disrespecting our troops. Well, we heard that lately, right? Okay, and of course, it was pretty easy to identify alcohol with the enemy during the years of the Great War. Beer was considered a German drink at that time. Good Americans drank whiskey. You know, the Washburn Times was, oh, I love the Washburn Times. It makes a wonderful source Beer and Berlin begin with the same letter, and if you don't believe beer is German, just refresh your memory by running lightly over a few such names as Pabst, Schlitz, and Anheuser-Busch. You'll see it over and again. The brewers are agents of the Kaiser. And one of the interesting things that you find out is, as the temperance movement and the prohibition movement is picking up steam, those opposed to it were fragmented. They couldn't get along. For instance, the distilling council, the big whiskey makers had their lobbying group. The distilling council, the beer brewers down in Milwaukee and St. Louis had their own lobby. They wouldn't talk to each other. The prohibition groups are pushing in a united front. The others are saying, oh, we don't want to deal with the brewers, says the liquor guys, and the brewers are saying, we want to do what we can, but we don't want to get with those guys. And as a result, it became easier and easier to inch forward to the implementation of the 18th Amendment. And when I say inch and move forward and talking about pressure groups, this is the guy who really made it happen. His name was Waynewheeler, and he was the head of a group called the Anti-Saloon League. And this is the group that basically took up the reins from the WCTU, took over, reoriented the whole movement, and essentially pushed it through. Wheeler is a fascinating guy to study in terms of modern day current events, because he basically invented the modern day pressure group. As a matter of fact, he did come out, he's the guy who actually coined the phrase pressure group. What he said he did is manage a minority. That means what he did was he worked on getting together a reliable, small, but absolutely dependable block of single-issue voters who could be counted on to come out every election and vote the way he told them to. And if you control maybe 5%, 10% of the swing votes, you're going to be able to decide an awful lot of close elections. So as a result, no congressman, no senator, no state legislature wanted to get on the bad side of Waynewheeler and the Anti-Saloon League. Well, there's the big picture. Got that all established. Let's zoom in now to our neighborhood. How are things going up here in Cheddarland? Welcome to Wisconsin. We love our beer. You want to know the funny thing? Wisconsin, up here, this neighborhood here in Washburn, we went dry 5 years before the rest of the country did. Yeah, that's the surprising thing. When you think about prohibition as this monolithic, sudden change in American society and American laws that was implemented by this pressure group, there is a degree of truth in that in terms of the overall picture and the amendment to the Constitution. But as with anything else in terms of history, it's more complicated than that. Because inch by inch, county by county, city by city, the nation was already going dry by that point. Let's take a look at how that happened too. Let's again, two wonderful sources here: the Washburn Times and the Ashland Daily Press. Both newspapers were vehemently dry. Week after week, day after day, in terms of the press, they would have editorials, columns pushing prohibition, knocking alcohol, pointing out alcohol as the root of all evils, and also pointing out, oh, don't worry, those of you who say that You know, a saloon ban will mess up the economy. Don't. It's just the opposite. If we get rid of alcohol, everybody will be much more prosperous because the workers will be more productive and they'll be happier and they'll go home and spend their times with their families. Wipe out the saloon and give Washburn a chance to grow, says the headline. Well, by the time national prohibition went into effect, the northern tier of Wisconsin was almost entirely dry thanks to these local option privilege. By 1918, the only town of any size from Superior to Hurley where you could get a drink was Iron River, sometimes known as Iron Liver. And you read through these papers and the columns, they got the articles, there's some absolute gems. A letter to the editor in 1910, liquor is the son of Satan, the father of all crimes, the mother of all abomination, the devil's best friend, and God's greatest enemy. Next week, same column, pointed out just, don't worry, things will go so well if we can just get rid of demon rum. If Chicago should go dry, they could reduce the expenses of the city by at least 1/2. This would compensate for the lost tax revenue. 75% of the time of the average policeman is spent caring for the products of the saloons. The jails and police stations of Chicago would be quiet places. I don't recall that's how it worked out in Chicago during the Prohibition years. A little bit off on their projection. But again, take a look at that particular headline there. Why vote out the saloon and give Washburn a chance to grow? There's a key issue jumping out there is that none of these prohibition advocates at the time, at least, or at least openly, were talking about a ban on alcohol. They were talking about closing the saloons over and over. It wasn't stop people from drinking, it was shut down the saloons. They managed to paint the owners of bars and taverns and saloons, as they called them in the day, as villains who were sucking the lifeblood, the health, etc., out of the common man. It's always the man. It's always the fathers, you know, are squandering their money, and we have to help by closing the saloons. It was very convenient to be able to paint the saloon keeper as the villain at a time when essentially that's where most working people then drank, was in a saloon. You didn't have canned beer, bottled beer at the time. If you wanted a beer, you had to go to a tavern and get some. And if you have a headline in the paper that says, should we or should we not approve the license bill? What does that mean? We're talking about driver's licenses, dog licenses, what? It was basically a code word for shutting down the saloon. Week in and week out, you would have headlines about the license issue. And that was enough to bring out the hardcore of anti-alcohol voters, but it wasn't scary enough to work up everybody else to say, oh my God, they're going to take my beer away. They told license, and you go on. So again, masterful public relations by the Temperance Forces, and I'm using temperance and prohibition fairly interchangeably here at this point. One of the more amazing things that you find out, some of the maneuvering that the Temperance Forces went to was they went back and reread the various treaties with the different Native American nations. And sure enough, somebody found a clause next door in Minnesota that in one of the treaties that was still in force, it said no alcohol can be sold in any area subject to this treaty. That was about, well, it was 14 counties of northern Minnesota. Suddenly, all of a sudden went dry. Survived court challenges and everything else. The Temperance Forces found this clause in a treaty that essentially closed down the bars in almost a third of Minnesota. And then they came to Wisconsin and started looking at it, and here's the ceded territory from the treaty. And there was a move, just like that, to shut down alcohol distribution in almost, a third there of Wisconsin as well. Well, that particular issue became moot because it was never resolved by the time that the 18th Amendment was passed. But as I said, it was already a done deal here in a lot of our towns. If we look at the election results, there was essentially an anti-saloon bill on the ballot almost every year, going back as far as 1896. And if you look at the totals as they go through, in 1896, the wet votes swamped the dry votes by a huge margin here in Washburn, 480 vote margin. Every time though around, the margin of the wet voters and the dry voters shifted a little bit. And by 1910, there was only 73 votes separating the voting blocks. By 1913, 50 vote margin. By 1914, Washburn went dry by a margin of 26 votes. 1915, Bayfield voted dry. 1918, Ashland went dry. 1919, Ashland decided to go wet again. Well, everything changed, right? It says right there. Oops, dry law has no effect on drunks. What happened? Well, already, and this is even before national prohibition comes in, things are shifting. And one of the things we see right away, remember how we're just going to close down the saloons? They have what they call mission creep these days. We close down the saloons, and next thing you know, these crusaders are going to people's homes. January 7th, 1915, the cops went into a house here in Washburn and busted a kegger, confiscated a keg of beer that the partiers had dragged over the lake from Ashland on a sled. Police chief said beer parties will not be tolerated in Washburn. So again, reaching and reaching and reaching until in December 1917, went through the legislature, and January 1919, U.S., the entire country, quote unquote, votes dry. Now exactly what did the 18th Amendment say? The 18th Amendment basically gave the government the power to ban intoxicating beverages. And that's what it says. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States is prohibited. So the phrase they used in the 18th Amendment was intoxicating liquors. And that's not real precise. What is an intoxicating liquor? That was deliberately left ambiguous because everybody wanted to interpret it their own way. Those representatives and senators who wanted to vote for the amendment but didn't want to stir the pot so much could tell themselves, well, that'll ban the hard stuff, but we can get away with leaving beer and light wines out there for the people. Well, not so fast, because a year later, when they finally passed the law that gave teeth to the amendment, there was a key change. The 18th Amendment made it possible The National Prohibition Act, also known as the Volstead Act, put it into effect, and wheeling and dealing and horse trading and all the rest, that they settled on a definition of what an intoxicating liquor meant. Just about everything. The words beer, wine, and other intoxicating malt or venous liquors shall be hereafter construed to mean any such beverages which contain 1/2 of 1% or more of alcohol by volume. You know what 1/2 of 1% of alcohol means? It means you left some sauerkraut in the refrigerator too long. 1/2 of 1% of alcohol is in all sorts of foods. And that was in, quote unquote, the Volstead Act. This is Representative Andrew Volstead of Minnesota. He was the bill's sponsor. He went down with it. A couple years later, his next re-election, he lost. But this guy was smiling. Our old buddy Waynewheeler, he's the one who pushed and insisted on that very restrictive definition of what an intoxicating liquor would be. So with that in the law now, all through the country, how does that affect our own local area here? That's a headline for you. Apostle Island's called Major Booze Way Station. And here we go, Bayfield County Press, November 12th, 1920. The Apostle Islands, according to reports from Ashland, are the center of activities to smugglers who are furnishing northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan with booze. The uninhabited islands are also said to contain moonshine distilleries. Madeline Island has been searched without results. The outer islands, notably Bear Island, Devil's Island, and Sand Island, are suspected of being way stations on the route of smugglers from Canadian ports to those of Wisconsin and Michigan. They even had a destroyer out there. The United States sub-chaser Cook has been cruising Lake Superior and has been especially watchful around the Apostle Islands. Well, the Cook was actually the ship that caught the Faithful there too, by the way. So there's a connection there. And all I can think is when it says Madeline Island was searched without results, they weren't looking hard enough. Here's an article from the Washburn Times in 1921. The adventures of Wisconsin prohibition officials with the moonshiners of the northern woods would furnish exploits which would serve as material for a modern series of adventure novels worthy of James Fenimore Cooper. Very literate reporter there. And then really gets into the spirit of things. I'm not kidding you, he starts out. It was a dark and rainy night when the officers proceeded to their first objective, a dugout deep in the woods where a former Kentuckian was known to be manufacturing moonshine. Stalking through the underbrush, the men closed in on the underground hut. So the agents arrest old Daniel Boone or whatever, and then they take the reporter out on the lake. The officers sighted a lone man standing on the shore as they turned to the island. He disappeared hurriedly. Less than 100 feet back from the shore, his still was found. Further search revealed a large moonshine manufacturing establishment which the officers sought, but their quarry had vanished. The building had been erected at the bottom of a ravine near Big Bay and was so situated that it could not be seen from the lake nor from the top of the ravine. Only when the observer came within 4 rods of it could it be discerned. A barrel of mash was confiscated, but the stills were not found, the men having made off with them when the revenue cutter approached. Well, you want to hide your still. You can put it in a ravine, you can put it back in a field. You know what would be a great place, I think, to hide a still? How about in a cave? January 24th, 1924, Prohibition agents got a tip. There's a still in one of the sea caves along the shore, just outside of Washburn. It's Washburn Times, January 24th, 1924. 20 barrels of mash, a 100-gallon still, and over 50 gallons of moonshine whiskey were secured by state prohibition officials on Monday evening of this week when they raided a cave on the lakeshore 2 miles west of Washburn. And one Ed Ferguson, said to be the owner of the outfit, was placed under arrest. Then it gets interesting. The Prohibition agents were tipped off to the location of the cave and made their way out of Washburn Monday evening at about 6 o'clock. They found the cave, which had the front of it boarded up to exclude the wind and cold, and upon entering, discovered a complete moonshine outfit. The place was deserted at the time. Entering the cave, the Prohibition men lighted the oil burner and made the place comfortable and warm, sat down to wait developments. About 10:30 that evening, they heard the footsteps of men on the snow outside, and as they opened the door, the raiding party threw a strong searchlight upon the party and invited them into the cave. 4 men sheepishly filed in and unloaded the supplies for their business. 3 of the 4 men were from Washburn. Well, all right, so far the bust is going smoothly, and then things kind of go wrong. The long wait had frozen up the officer's car, and they could not start it. But a Chevrolet car, which the men had used to bring in their supplies, was brought into use and towed the other car loaded down with supplies to the county jail. They arrived shortly after midnight. Okay, you're under arrest. Can we borrow your car? Well, on the other hand, it didn't always work out so amicably. 1921, August 25th. Fusillade of shots rained at autoists. 3 men, heavily armored, led a fast getaway from Bayfield, caught by Washburn police. The gunfight at Bayfield occurred at about 2 o'clock Tuesday morning when a big 6 Nash touring car coasted into Bayfield without lights and with the engine stopped. Night watchman Frank Jelinek saw the men enter the city and began to investigate to determine what they were up to. One thing led to another. Mr. Jelinek spooked the lookout. The 3 men jumped in their car and took off. Along the way, one guy ran into a fence, another pulled a gun on a bystander. They finally drove off. The night watchman, Mr. Jelinek, started taking pot shots at them, hitting a car in a couple places. So he calls the Washburn police, and they set up a roadblock to the intersection of the road down to Houghton. And when the gunmen get there, they see the roadblock and surrender without further gunplay. So nobody gets hurt. Next morning, in the daylight, the sheriff's deputies find a .38 caliber revolver and a .45 automatic tossed away on the roadside. They threw out their guns. Well, it turns out the men were from Ashland and Superior, and one of them had just gotten out of Leavenworth, and quote unquote, but after considerable questioning, the only charge that could be preferred against the trio was driving an automobile without lights. Okay, well, okay. And pointing the loaded revolver. Fine of $64. Just what the men were doing at Bayfield and what their game was has not been learned, for the party was broken up shortly after the men arrived. By the way, just so you know, Wisconsin law had what they call the fleeing felon doctrine. That basically, you could shoot at them even though they were driving away. Even though they were retreating and had their backs and were hauling away, it was legal to shoot, to stop, quote unquote, a fleeing felon all the way up to 1985. And there were a number of shootings during that era that were under that doctrine, which would definitely not fly today. And with that, any discussion of booze in northern Wisconsin would not be complete without taking a look over in Hurley. Would it, really? Come on. And sure enough, there was one of those raids that turned deadly in 1920. Hurley Smuggler is killed, it says in the Ashland Press. 6 revenue officers tried to stop 4 automobiles loaded with liquor near Mercer and killed one who tried to escape. Well, what happened was the revenue men got a tip that there was a car loaded with booze coming up on its way to Hurley from Milwaukee, and they barricaded the road between Woodruff and Mercer to intercept it. 18 revenue agents stationed between Woodruff and Mercer Saturday night stopped 4 automobiles, 4 loads of whiskey en route to Hurley from Milwaukee. And in the fight which ensued, John Chapuzio, one of the proprietors of the Senate Hotel of Hurley, was killed. The first car was stopped at 8:30, 16 miles south of Hurley. He swung a lantern. Driver and the companion jumped from the car and ran off into the woods. Mr. Chapuzio, who was one of the occupants of the car, was shot 4 times in the back, trying to escape into the woods. Again, the fleeing felon doctrine in action. So, the revenue officers flagged down a passing car to take him to the hospital. Say what? They had to arrange a ride to get the guy to the hospital. But again, it was a different world then, different ways of doing things. And then, of course, the bootleggers are treated as heroes in Hurley, and actually they brought charges against one of the revenue agents who was based out of Michigan, and he just said, I'm not going back to Wisconsin. The state of Michigan would not extradite him to Wisconsin, and it all blew over. But the mayor of Ironwood served as the lead defense attorney for all the bootleggers, and eventually all cases were dismissed, and life in Hurley returned to normal for another 5 years until the governor had the idea of closing down the saloons in Hurley. 1926, 5 years later, the law came to Hurley again on Tuesday when Deputy United States Marshals padlocked 29 saloons, and there are those who hope it will take this time. Service of the court orders, I love this. Service of the court orders was more or less a parade up Silver Street, Hurley's main street. The officers started at a saloon at number 7 Silver Street and marched 5 blocks up the street to Marble Hall, stopping in saloons on both sides of the notorious thoroughfare. And pretty much by the time they got to the end of the block, the first ones they padlocked were opening up again, having paid their appropriate bribes. Happened again, 1931. Raid closed 42 saloons. People in Hurley rally behind them. 60 arrests. 1 out of every 40 residents of Hurley. To give you an idea of the size of the issue. Well, and they weren't all desperados. They weren't all rum runners. They weren't all gunmen and smugglers and moonshine. A lot of them were just ordinary folks trying to make a buck, or trying to protect, provide for their families, or just to get a drink. One of the unintended side effects of Prohibition was essentially turning America into a nation of criminals. Both of my grandfathers patronized bootleggers at one point or other. Neither of them were particularly big drinkers, but they both found reason to it. My grandmother, on my father's side, decided to take my father to a speakeasy as a little kid because she was kind of a wild lady, and said, my son ought to at least know what it's like out here. They wouldn't let her in with the little kid. I thought it was interesting. And again, the typical bust did not involve a gunfight. It was more just an ordinary guy like this gentleman out here on Sand Island. This kindly old man named Burt Hill. He left us a diary of his life on Sand Island, and every now and then you get a little note like this. There was a wildfire out there, grass fire, that swept one of the farm fields out there on the island. Then he writes, I was somewhat worried as I had 65 cases of Canadian Giggle water hid in the pasture. Had to track that down. Giggle water? I had an idea what it meant. Sure enough, that's what it meant, all right. I got Magnus Palm to help me, and we hauled the cases out. When we went after the last load, the fire was within a few feet of where I had the stuff hidden. I received $50 from a superior party for keeping it there. Well, prices at that time, $50 would have paid for his winter's groceries. And again, to give an idea of just how widespread, we're going to take a look at 1 month here in August of 1922. Just over the course of this 1 month, Albert Sundquist on Nevers Road, 2 stills, barrels, coolers, 41 gallons of moonshine, 250 gallons of mash confiscated. Same month. Same month. Lambert Burgo on the Wanabo Road, arrested. Revenue agents confiscated 1 still, 180 gallons of mash, 1/2 quart of moonshine, and 1 still. Adolf Nolander of Nolander Road, arrested in Ashland with 1 bottle of moonshine. You pick up a paper at random, chances are very good that any particular issue, there's going to be talk of somebody in town, somebody that probably you may know, busted on a moonshine charge of one sort or another. Let's continue looking around our neighborhood here. There was that still in the Sea Cave was by no means the only booze operation here in Washburn, by no means at all. Instance, there was a speakeasy up near the corner of Washington Avenue and Oak Street. And the one I like best is my own neighborhood, up on the hillside. 8th Avenue West was called by some folks Bootleg Hill. My friend Hope McLeod and Bruce Bowers, where they live, there was a still and a moonshine operation. Hope was telling me that when they moved in, Bruce tripped over part of an old still in the grass. And then a little bit later, an older lady comes in and drops in and says, yes, this is my grandpa's house when I grew up here. He made moonshine. Hope wrote a poem about it. I'll just read a little bit. Grandpa bootlegged, the old woman points to a fishing shack in the woods. Customers sat out on the lawn at pine tables and straight-back chairs. Some nights they laughed so loud I could hardly sleep. Those of you who live in Washburn, there is at least a good chance that somebody was brewing or consuming moonshine where you are today. So anyway, well, how did that affect everyone? I think a lot of these were just ordinary working people arrested again August 18th, 1920. Just pick months at random in Ashland. Charles Erickson, a farmer from Bayfield, 90 days in the Ashland County Jail for possession of liquor and equipment to manufacture same. Mrs. Prohaska, a farmer's wife outside of Bayfield. Sheriff's deputy was staking the place out, watched her go out into a swamp and come back with 3 pints of booze. Tried and convicted, sentenced to pay a fine of $300 and spend 4 months in jail. Or spend 4 months in jail, $300, a lot of money. Farmer's wife opted for the jail time. Here's one that's interesting. Ignaz Brosovich there made booze to support his family. December 8, 1921. In order to make money to pay the interest on the mortgage on his farm and assist him through the long, hard winter, Brosovich went into the moonshining business and got caught making his first delivery of liquor into Ashland. Charged in Bayfield County, making the booze, and in Ashland for selling it. So double charges, sentenced to 30 days on each of the charges. And here's, again, protecting the families, we're protecting the families. Brosovich has 9 children, none of whom are old enough to look after the farm. He stated that times were so bad that he acted on the advice of neighbors and began manufacturing moonshine, even though he knew it was wrong. His wife will be given support by the county while her husband serves his sentence. So there you go. Solving social ills by legislation. And of course there's another side effect that comes out. That vodka liquor that people were making was not always the best kind, and once you just turn people loose without any regulation whatsoever, people start stretching the supply using whatever ingredients they have, and you read headlines about people being killed by the vodka whiskey. John Mickelson, Drummond, 55-year-old logger. Diane McKenzie, 17-year-old rookie lumberjack from Canada, never came home from Ashland. Walter Anderson in Grandview, a 16-year-old boy left outside to dance by his friends just to sleep it off, never woke up. Or John Tram here, 34-year-old stonemason from Madeline Island, went on a toot in his cabin with 2 of his friends, never woke up. The other guy's dead, he did not. But, it's all to protect the family. Well, what happens? Eventually, people start thinking, this is not working. And eventually, The amendment was repealed, and there was joy and celebration throughout the land, right? Well, was Prohibition a failure? They called it the noble experiment. Wow, that's quite the concept when you think about it. The noble experiment, an experiment which never happened before. If you look at the Constitution for a minute, this was essentially the first time the Constitution had an amendment that said what the government could do to stop people from doing something. That and the 14th Amendment, essentially in ending slavery. All the other amendments restricted the power of government. This is one that expanded government's reach into people's private lives. What effects did it have? Well, we talked about some of the effects here in the local area. We can think of many phenomena that changed. You know, the decline of small breweries. The fact that women started going into bars for the first time, really, after the repeal. It opened up the atmosphere for women. The old-time saloon was definitely dead. As a matter of fact, here in Wisconsin, it was, even long after Prohibition was repealed, it was illegal to open a saloon in Wisconsin. You could open a bar, you could open a tavern, you could open a nightclub, but God help you if you decided to call it Murphy's Saloon. That was against the law. The word saloon was banned in Wisconsin until 1977. So, was it a failure? People drink a lot less today than they did on the eve of Prohibition. For a while there, they were drinking about a third less, you know, 1/3 of what the consumption was in the 19th century. It started inching up, but the consumption is nothing like it was then. So it had its mixed results, but I think everyone can agree. We're glad it's over, and I'm personally glad that I didn't have to live through it. So remember, at times like this, the law of unintended consequences apply, and there may be a boat out there in a sand dune on the islands that has something to do with a law that was passed down in Washington far away. The threads of history tangled together. Folks, thank you for coming out tonight. I enjoyed coming out and telling you a little bit about this, and happy to get questions afterwards. Thanks again. Bar's open, right?